The drifter sought only shelter from the storm, but 3 prairie sisters offered him something far more precious: Wyoming territory. Early winter, 1885, a fierce blizzard swept across the open grasslands like a raging beast, its icy fangs tearing through the cottonwood groves surrounding Sweetwater Valley. The wind howled down from the snow-capped peaks, hurling sleet in brutal waves across the rangeland. Ice turned wagon ruts into treacherous traps, and fence wires snapped like violin strings. Along the forgotten Carson Creek Trail, a solitary horseman fought through the tempest, frozen, wordless, and barely conscious in his weather-beaten saddle. Marcus Stone hadn't uttered a sound in miles. His coat collar was pulled high, ice crystals forming steadily on the wool. The gelding under him wheezed with exhaustion, its flanks heaving. But through the swirling white, a beacon appeared, amber light dancing between frost-covered aspens. A homestead. Single-story, built sturdy against a stone foundation with a wraparound porch. Warmth glowed through frost-etched windows like a prayer answered. Marcus slid from his mount with stiff limbs, boots crunching into snow. He stumbled toward the steps, raised one numb fist, and rapped 3 times on the solid oak door. Oh, the portal opened a crack. A woman with auburn hair and fierce green eyes filled the gap. Her wool shawl was wrapped tight, but her stance was rigid. In her grip, a hunting rifle aimed squarely at his midsection. "We don't welcome strangers past dark," she declared. "Not unless you're already dead." Marcus blinked, snow melting on his weathered cheeks. "Just need somewhere to wait out this blizzard. Your barn looks sound enough." "Barn's got a hole in the east wall, big enough for a horse to walk through," she replied curtly before Marcus could respond. Another voice drifted from the kitchen, gentler, warmer, belonging to someone perhaps a few years younger. "Rose, let the man inside. Nobody deserves to freeze in weather like this." The auburn-haired woman's grip tightened on her weapon. For a heartbeat, it seemed she might slam the door. Then she lowered the rifle and stepped aside. "Try any foolishness," she warned, "and you'll wish the cold had taken you first." "Much obliged for the hospitality," Marcus replied, stepping across the threshold. Heat enveloped him like an embrace. The cabin smelled of pine pitch and chamomile. A potbelly stove radiated warmth from the corner. Pine floorboards groaned under his snow-crusted boots. The second woman emerged from the shadows, chestnut hair wound in a simple knot, eyes the color of sage honey. She carried a kerosene lamp against her chest. "You're soaked to the bone," she observed. "There's a wool throw in the cedar chest." "Grace, fetch it," Rose commanded, but didn't move herself. Grace set down her lamp and retrieved the blanket personally. "What do folks call you?" she asked kindly. "Marcus Stone." A third voice made him turn. It came from near the fireplace. "Girl, no." A young woman sat, curled in a carved rocking chair like a cat. She couldn't be past 19. All golden ringlets and bright eyes with a grin that seemed too playful for such harsh weather. "Marcus," she repeated, rolling the name around her tongue. "You don't look like a common drifter, more like a preacher who lost his congregation." "Hope," Grace said with gentle reproach. "What?" "I'm simply making conversation." He has that expression, like someone stole his future. Marcus studied the 3 of them. Rose, the eldest, stood guard like a sentinel, though she couldn't be older than 30. Grace, with her steady lamp, seemed to be searching his face for memories she couldn't quite place. And Hope, the youngest, barely contained her curiosity. As she examined him like an unsolved puzzle, "No menfolk around this place?" Marcus asked, lowering himself onto a bench near the fire. "No," Rose snapped, "and there won't be." "There was someone once," he pressed gently. "You asked plenty of questions for a man who just wanted to escape the weather," Hope chimed in, sliding forward in her chair. "But no, it's just we 3. Been for quite some time." Grace placed a steaming mug before him. "Wild mint tea. We cultivate it in the summer garden." Marcus accepted the cup gratefully. Steam warmed his face. "You can bed down in the grain shed," Rose said flatly. "Don't disturb anything. Don't venture near the root cellar. Don't speak to anyone who might pass by." clear crystal. She opened the door again, and the wind screamed as if hunting him personally. Marcus rose, blanket and tea in hand. "I'm grateful," he said, pausing in the doorway. Grace moved beside her sister and offered the slightest nod. "It's only until the storm breaks." But even as the door closed behind him, Marcus sensed it. The house he'd entered wasn't simply refuge from winter's fury. Something deeper dwelt here, something wounded and watchful. Beneath the relentless Wyoming blizzard, Marcus made his way to the weathered grain shed behind the log dwelling. The roof, constructed from hand-split cedar and rough planks, allowed wind to whistle through gaps in several places. Frozen air bit at his exposed skin, settling into corners already thick with old snow. By lamplight, he discovered sacks of oats, stacked with care, a rusty scythe, and a cracked water barrel. The women clearly maintained what they could manage, but some tasks required strength they simply didn't possess. Marcus hung his damp blanket over a hay fork and wrung ice from his sleeves. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air. Rather than rest, he examined the ceiling where wind whistled through a gaping breach. With a quiet oath, he climbed onto a grain barrel and studied the damage closely. One entire section had collapsed. Inward, letting the blizzard pour onto stored supplies below. He drew his clasp knife and set to work. Using torn burlap, spare horseshoe nails, and an old length of hemp rope, he fashioned a temporary repair. His hands, scarred and sure, moved with quiet efficiency. The storm drove snow sideways through the shed's openings, soaking his shoulders as he labored, but he made no complaint. Only his steady breathing and the soft tap of metal on wood broke the silence. When finished, Marcus climbed down, snow clinging to his worn boots. He stood in the open doorway, watching the tempest without expression. Somewhere behind him, something rustled. He turned slowly. On a wooden peg by the entrance, a folded cloth now hung dry, clean, and unexpected. He looked around carefully. No one visible, but he knew someone had visited. Marcus took the fabric, drying his face with deliberate movements. It carried the faint scent of chamomile. Outside in the darkness, just beyond the porch's shelter, Grace stood in shadow. She had observed everything Marcus mending the roof without request, expecting no gratitude or recognition. Her arms were crossed, but not from the cold. Snow swept across the pasture behind him, silver under starlight. He didn't spot her, and she didn't reveal herself, simply retreated quietly into the warmth. The following dawn brought pale light creeping over the distant peaks. The blizzard had passed, though mist still clung like breath to the prairie grass. Marcus woke to the sound of something being set outside carefully. He opened the shed door to discover a wooden tray balanced on a tree stump, a bowl of hot cornmeal mush, pewter spoon, and a tin cup of steaming coffee. No message, no voice, simply nourishment waiting. He lifted the tray, cradling the bowl in both hands briefly before taking a taste. Later that morning, while moving a stack of split wood under cover to keep it dry, Marcus noticed something on the high shelf tucked beneath a canvas tarp, a daguerreotype. He picked it up carefully. 3 women posed before the cabin, Rose arms folded and stern, Hope younger, laughing as she held a barn cat. Grace stood between them, calm and observant. But beside Grace, a 4th figure, a man, taller than the others. His face completely scratched away from the image, removed so thoroughly as if someone wanted to erase him while preserving everything. Elsnot Marcus stood there for long minutes, staring at that empty space. The photograph felt incomplete until that missing face seemed to stare back. He replaced it exactly where he'd found it. As he stepped into the morning light, the quiet of the homestead settled around him. The mystery of the defaced photograph lingered more than he cared to admit. On the 3rd morning, sun rose behind heavy clouds, casting gray stillness over the land. Marcus was splitting kindling under the back eaves when he heard the slow creak of wagon wheels approaching. A ox-drawn cart rolled down the muddy track. An elderly man with a battered hat and weathered jaw sat behind the reins. He pulled up beside the fence and called out, "Mail delivery for the Harper sisters." Marcus set down his axe and approached. "I'll fetch someone." But the man's eyes had already fixed on him suspiciously. He stared hard. Then his expression darkened. "You ain't family?" "No," Marcus replied evenly. "Just traveling through." The man said nothing more. He dropped a mail pouch with a thud, touched his hat brim without another word, and departed faster than he'd arrived. Marcus watched the cart vanish over the ridge road later in the kitchen. He asked Rose as she kneaded bread dough. That fellow left like he'd seen a specter. She didn't glance up. "He talks too much, thinks too little." He seemed to recognize something. "Then he knows more than he should." Marcus waited, but Rose turned away, wiped flour on her apron, and changed the subject. "Firewood needs restacking before the next storm arrives." That night, sleep came fitfully. The wind tapped against the shed door like someone afraid to knock. Marcus sat up on his cot. Outside was stillness. Then faint but clear, he heard it weeping. Not loud or dramatic, a steady, heartbroken sound coming from beneath the cabin. He stepped outside. Boots silent on the frozen ground, and followed the sound to a storm cellar entrance. Locked, he pressed his ear close. The crying ceased. The next morning, Grace packed a wicker basket and walked past the corral, heading toward the stand of pine trees beyond the ridge. Marcus, chopping wood nearby, noticed. I hadn't taken the shotgun that rested by the kitchen door. He hesitated, then followed at a distance, from cover. He watched her gather herbs and winter berries, carefully cutting stems with a curved blade. Her movements were practiced and sure, but her eyes darted around nervously. When her boot slipped on an icy stone, she stumbled backward. Marcus caught her before she fell. For a moment, her breathing stopped. Then she looked up at him, cheeks flushed. "You followed me. You didn't bring the gun. You think I need protecting? I didn't want to see you hurt." She pulled back slightly, but didn't release his arm immediately. "You're cautious, Marcus Stone, even when it's unnecessary." They sat beneath a leaning pine, the basket of herbs between them. The wind had gentled, carrying the scent of evergreen. After a while she asked, "You never questioned who we are." He looked at her directly. "Did you want me to?" She shook her head. "Most men would have, or at least tried to pry. I used to be someone everyone doubted and no one heard." Grace's expression softened. "Someone wounded you." He gave a brief laugh. "No, just cracked me enough to let the light in." She studied him for a long moment. "That's the first thing you've said that sounded like verse." Marcus looked away. It must be the present company. By the time they returned, the wind had shifted. Marcus stayed behind as Grace entered the house. That evening, the cellar door creaked again. Curious, Marcus returned. It stood unlocked this time. Stepped inside, descending narrow steps into the dark earth. Shelves lined the walls, preserved peaches, sacks of flour, old implements. Then, at the far end, a small iron strongbox. Dusty locked. Etched into the lid, barely visible in the dim light, TH. He traced his fingers over the letters. Cold metal, worn smooth. Marcus exhaled slowly. This house held memories and mysteries, and not all of them wished to stay buried. The afternoon sun hung low over the prairie sky, casting golden light on. The pasture where frost still clung to the fence posts Marcus had spent all morning mending. His shirt was damp with sweat, forearms marked from wire and splinters. But it was the tremor in his left hand that he couldn't seem to control, not from weariness, but something deeper, rooted further back than the last broken rail. Grace appeared. Without announcement, her apron already stained with dried herbs and faded from years of careful washing. In her hands was a small linen pouch, the kind used for remedies or gentle healing. She didn't ask him to rest. Him in the brown grass, and took his hand as though she had done it countless times. He allowed her. The wind moved softly around them, rustling the wheat stubble, but neither spoke for a moment. Oh, her fingers were warm, not cold. Her touch was deliberate. She unwrapped the linen and gently applied a salve over the torn skin near his wrist. "When?" She looked up. Her voice was softer than the breeze. "Has this hand ever drawn iron against another man?" Marcus hesitated, his jaw tightening once before he answered. Only when I knew there was no choice left. She didn't look away. Her eyes remained on him, steady, unreadable, but far from cold. Yet the hands of someone who's given up more than he intended. He wanted to smile, but it caught somewhere deep. So instead, he looked down at her hands, still tending. His own like they weren't scarred or rough from years of hard country and mistakes. Later they stood beside the old bay mare, who had begun wheezing again the previous week. Her breathing had become shallow, anxious, the way sick animals sometimes shiver before nightfall. Marcus had gathered the same herbs Grace once brought home, crushed them into a bitter paste, and rubbed them gently along the mare's gums, whispering to her in the language his grandmother taught him as a child, syllables soft like rain on leaves. He moved with such quiet gentleness that Grace didn't interrupt, only observed. The horse calmed beneath his touch, the rise and fall of her ribs settling into steady rhythm again. Marcus gave her one last stroke down the muzzle, then stepped back. Grace stepped forward, rested her palm on the mare's neck. Her voice was barely audible. You soothed her, and me. Marcus met her eyes, and something unspoken passed between them, fragile but unmistakable, like a flame lit in darkness. Small, but not weak. Hope, never far away when silence stretched too long, suddenly appeared around the barn corner. Her voice carried mischief. Are you sweet on my sister, cowboy? Marcus blinked. Grace turned away so quickly that her braid nearly swept across her shoulder, the tips of her ears already crimson. She disappeared into the house without a backward glance. Marcus watched her go. He didn't smile, not entirely, but there was a peace in his eyes, not the kind that comes from loneliness, but from seeing something worth remaining for. Hope leaned against the fence and studied him closely. Well, she asked again. Marcus ran a thumb along the edge of his belt buckle, his gaze still fixed on the door Grace had just closed behind her. I once chose correctly, he said quietly, and lost her. Hope's teasing faded. This time, Marcus added, his voice low, I'm learning how to choose again. And with that, he turned back to the mare. But the air around him was different, lighter, warmer, as though the prairie had just heard a promise it intended to keep. The storm had passed, but the cabin still carried the scent of damp wood and yesterday's quiet. Marcus stepped into the shed that morning, not to repair anything, but because something in his dreams had whispered a direction. Something hidden had stirred beneath the floorboards. He had taken to cleaning the space, organizing the corners with more attention than a guest ought to show. That was when his boot knocked loose, a floor plank warped from years of freeze and thaw. Beneath it, wrapped in faded cloth, was a folded letter, sealed but never delivered. The handwriting was careful, slanted, written by someone who had once tried to write beautifully, but whose sorrow made the pen pause. To Thomas Harper, it read. Marcus sat alone by the open door and read slowly, like deciphering whispers. The letter was brief. A woman confessed she had witnessed something she should have prevented, that she had loved him, though not in the way he deserved, that she carried the burden of silence heavier than any guilt. You trusted people could heal, she had written, but I only stood by. The air grew still around him. There was no signature, but the voice between the lines held Grace's quiet strength. Or perhaps Rose's restraint, he couldn't tell. All he knew was that whoever wrote this had found no peace, and whoever Thomas was, he never received it. That evening, Grace stepped into the shed just as the sun disappeared behind the hills. Her hands were empty, but her eyes searched until they found him in the doorway, sitting as if anchored to memory. He stood when he saw her, but she raised a hand gently. Would you care for some tea? She asked. Voice didn't try to explain. It simply welcomed. Inside the cabin, the air was warm with sage and dried flowers. It was the first time he sat in the main room, across from her, the teacups between them barely touched. Neither filled the space with questions. They watched fresh snow begin to fall, not like the blizzard from nights before, but a soft reminder that the world was still turning. I made this for you, Marcus said after a long while, reaching into his vest. He pulled out a small wooden box the size of a prayer book, smooth and simple. Its grain was rich, crafted from salvaged barnwood. He had sanded the edges until they felt like memory worn but gentle. Fear remedies, he added. Grace looked at the box as if it had been carved from something precious. When she took it into her hands, she ran her fingers over the joints, finding where one board met another, like mended seams. She looked up and her gaze lingered. People usually leave, she said quietly, once they see what this house carries. Hand brushed his as she held the box, and her voice dropped even softer. But you create gifts. Marcus didn't answer. His eyes met hers and stayed there. The knock on the door came like thunder against silk. They both turned. Rose reached the entrance first, rifle already in hand. Hope stood behind her, eyes sharp. A man stood on the porch, soaked in twilight and snow, coat hanging heavy on his frame, but his spine was straight, jaw set. His voice cut through the tension like a blade drawn slow from leather.
Elba Harper.
Sisters, I'll return when the truth does. His eyes passed over Marcus without lingering, as if he expected a man to be there. Then he turned and walked into the dark, his boots leaving no more sound than the snow did on the boards. Rose didn't. Speak! She lowered the gun, but her knuckles remained white on the grip. Grace's voice trembled when it came. It's time, she whispered. Marcus turned toward her. In her face, he saw something not quite fear, but a reckoning long postponed, and something else. She was not ready to tell the entire story, but she was ready to stop hiding from it, and four. Now, that was enough. The table had never been set for four, not since the man in the daguerreotype had disappeared. But that night, the aroma of rabbit stew filled the small cabin, and hope lit every lantern as if chasing shadows into corners. Marcus stood uncertainly by the entrance, until Rose nodded toward the chair at the far end. No one made speeches. Grace simply placed a bowl before him, rich broth, tender potatoes, and something green he couldn't identify, but welcomed like old comfort. They ate quietly. The only sounds were spoons against bowls, the soft clink of tin cups, the gentle murmur of wind outside. Hope cracked a joke about the snow being heaven's way of washing their troubles clean. Oh, Rose rolled her eyes, but the corner of her mouth turned up slightly. Marcus looked at them, all three women who had held their world together. Without a man for longer than most men stayed anywhere. Then he looked at his own hands, marked and steady, and spoke, not to impress, but to share something truer than facts. My grandmother used to say, he began, voice calm, that the most important person in your life isn't the one who knows your history. It's the one who chooses to stay when they don't even know where they belong. Silence followed. Not heavy, but thoughtful. Hope was the first to break it. It sounds like something a wise woman would say. Marcus smiled. She was indeed. After. The bowls were cleared and Hope disappeared to tend the animals despite the cold. Marcus found himself standing beside Grace on the porch. The night spread before them like a secret, waiting to be spoken. They walked slowly toward the back pasture, boots quiet on frozen earth. The moon cut thin lines of silver through the low clouds, brushing across the fence posts and scattered winter grass. Marcus didn't speak, letting the silence stretch. Sometimes silence was the only way to make room for what mattered. Grace finally did. Thomas, he wasn't our father. Marcus glanced sideways but said nothing. He was Rose's. She added softly, her first love. She was 18 when he came to help with the harvest. Stayed for 3 years, then he stayed for more. Marcus nodded once, waiting. He was gentle, steady, the sort of man who asked how your heart was before he asked what you planned to do. She stopped near the oak tree and rested her palm against the rough bark. He died right here, she said. Marcus followed her gaze to the base of the tree. There was trouble with someone from town. I was in the garden. I saw them struggle. I didn't call out. I froze. She turned to him, eyes wide and raw. If I tell you I saw death come and didn't raise my voice, would you think less of me for that? Marcus looked at her for a long while, not with judgment, but with the weight of someone who had carried silence like a stone in his chest. I've lived with regret too, he said. My brother was killed over cattle. I could have been there, but I wasn't. I've told myself 1,000 ways it wasn't my responsibility. Some days I believe it." He paused, taking a breath. "We don't always get to save the ones we love, but we can choose how we live after. We can choose what we build next." Grace looked at him, and for the first time since he arrived, her shoulders fell not from defeat, but release. In the distance, Hope's laughter rose faintly, chasing the night back into warmth. They stood like that, under the tree, where something had ended, and something else, just barely, was beginning. The knock at the door came with the cold breath of morning. This time it was not just a stranger with weary eyes. It was a second man behind him, tall and solemn, carrying a leather satchel and the kind of gaze that had witnessed to many endings. Rose opened the door, her fingers still dusted with flour. Hope stood behind her, silent. Grace didn't move from the window. "We need to speak," the older man said, "about the land and Thomas." Marcus stood by the hearth, his back straight. When they spread the papers on the table, he stepped closer. Documents were yellowed, the ink sharp, official, legal, final. "The deed names Thomas Harper as the sole owner," the lawyer said. "He made no will, left no living heirs. The land does not belong to you." Silence fell like a stone. Rose crossed her arms, but her jaw trembled. Hope bit her lip until it whitened. Grace looked down at her hands as if afraid of what she might do with them. Marcus reached into his vest. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out a folded letter. Worn at the creases, the paper had the marks of something read too many times, but never spoken aloud. He said, placing it beside the deed, was never sent. But it was written by the woman who loved him, by the one who watched him die. The lawyer lifted the page, reading silently, his brow furrowed, lips moving faintly with the words. When he finished, he looked at the sisters, then back at Marcus. "This is a confession," he said. "A statement of intent. It speaks of guardianship, love, and regret. In some courts, it may not change title, but here it changes truth." The man beside him, the one who had knocked, stepped forward. His voice cracked before it even reached the first word. "That was my brother," he whispered. "I came here to build a future. I thought he was just chasing something foolish." He looked at Rose, then Hope, then Grace. "I didn't know he gave everything for you." No one answered. The man turned to Marcus. "You had nothing to gain." "Why?" Marcus didn't blink. "'Cause someone should have stayed. He did, and now I will." He reached out, not for a handshake, not for thanks, but toward Grace. His fingers brushed hers, and this time she met him halfway. Her hand found his, and she held it not like someone afraid of losing, but like someone who had finally chosen to keep. The lawyer cleared his throat. "There will be documents, formalities, but with this, the land can remain. It is no longer contested." The man, Thomas's brother, nodded once, then turned away, eyes burning. As he left, no one spoke. No cheers, no tears, just a stillness that held the weight of what had passed and the quiet promise of something more. Marcus kept holding her hand. She kept holding back, but only the tears, not the truth. Not anymore. The sun had not fully risen. Over the ridgeline, when the lawyer touched his hat and stepped down from the porch, dust rose beneath his boots as he walked toward the waiting wagon. Thomas's brother followed behind, silent hands buried deep in his coat pockets. There were no farewells, just a nod, a glance, a truth settled into earth. Marcus stood at the gate, with his saddle roll slung over his shoulder. His gelding already saddled, pawed lightly at the frost-covered ground. The morning air bit sharp, but not sharper than the quiet between him and the three women behind him. He gave a soft whistle, ready to mount, but a low growl stopped him. Rusty Hope's scrappy little mutt stood firm in the gap of the gate. For paws planted, ears back, growling like a beast twice his size. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Rusty barked once. Loud, final. Hope leaned against the porch post, arms crossed, grinning. Rusty has a good nose for people who belong. Marcus let out a breath, more amused than surprised. Before he could speak, Grace stepped forward, a small pouch in hand. She held it out to him, sewn from soft brown leather, the kind that warmed with skin and time. "For your remedies," she said. "I made it from the hide you mended last week." He opened the flap slowly. Inside, neatly stitched into the lining, was a single line of thread. "To the man who gave us back hope." His throat tightened, but he said nothing. Hope gave him a gentle push. "You can't leave now. Grace still burns biscuits and thinks wild mint works in stew." Marcus turned to Grace. She was blushing, her eyes refusing to look directly at him. Rose, watching from the doorframe, added, "We used to live, not trusting anyone. Now there's someone who stayed even after knowing everything." Marcus looked around the yard, the mended fences, the stable he helped repair, the porch rail where Grace once placed a cup of tea without a word. It was not his land, but it had grown roots in him. He stepped forward past Rusty with a silent nod and walked back toward the house. Grace had gone inside, and now she was at the table, the old wooden one beneath the east window. She placed a fourth bowl beside the others, a spoon, a folded cloth. Nothing more. Marcus stepped through the door without a word, removed his hat and placed it on the wall hook. Rose's voice followed behind him like smoke, dry but soft. "You can sit for now," she said. "That seat." She nodded toward the bowl. "It's only for family." Marcus didn't answer her. He walked to the chair, pulled it out with the slow care of a man who had never been offered such a place, and sat then. He looked up at Grace, and she smiled, not wide, not bold, but steady. "Then you're sitting in the right place," she said. "If this tale stirred something in your soul, if it made you believe that even the loneliest heart can find home again, even in the wild quiet of Wyoming, then you've just discovered the kind of love we share here at Prairie Hearts Romance. We bring you stories of harsh land, tender souls, and love that rises from dust, loss, and hope. From gunfighters to healers, from widows to drifters, every heart here is just trying to find something worth staying for. Subscribe to our channel and ring the bell, so you never miss another story like The Fourth Chair, because out here in the West, bullets may miss, but hearts don't. Prairie Hearts Romance, where every story leaves behind the echo of something real.